Good evening, everybody. And I think this is a much more common topic in which everybody is very interested. And I would be focusing only on the recent advances that have happened over the course of one decade. Thyroid cancers in generally are very heterogeneous. Micropapillary carcinomas on one end of the spectrum, those are very indolent, to anaplastic carcinomas, which are one of the most lethal cancers in the body. But however, over a past one decade or so, there has been a lot of advances that have happened in the management of differentiated thyroid cancers. And my focus of the talk will be only on differentiated thyroid cancers because even thyroid cancers per se is a very extensive topic. Very brief glimpse into history before understanding the present state of our treatment and the future perspectives. Prior to 1850, the mortality, and hear me right, it's the mortality of thyroidectomies was 50%. And the mortality was primarily because of bleeding and other septic complications. So much so, if a surgeon operated on a thyroid cancer or otherwise, prior to 1850, he would be put in jail. Such was the sort of gravity of the magnitude of the mortality at that particular point of time. And it was reserved only when death was imminent. Even when Cocker, who was considered the father of surgery, who got the thyroid surgery, who got the Nobel Prize in 1917, his initial series had a mortality of 21%, but subsequently, I think he came to the mortality figures of 0.5%. And now, of course, we hardly ever talk of mortality in differentiated thyroid cancers. The focus remains on morbidity. So this is my talk schema. I will not go into the depths of each and every topic. I've just chosen 6 topics which has recent advances, and I'll focus only on the recent advances so that, to make the talk very focused. And I'm sure that, if there are any questions, we can obviously take it up in the discussion that will ensue subsequently. I will cover briefly about the advances in epidemiology, little bit of what the newer staging systems say, what's active surveillance, and this is a very controversial topic, but I'll try to sort of simplify it to you all. Incidentalomas known in adrenal and thyroid glands, how do we go about managing this? What are the advances there? Obviously, as surgeons, we have to talk about the extent of surgery. The new thing that's come up is a really complicated topic of risk stratification. There's something new called dynamic risk stratification, which I'll try to simplify for everybody. And obviously, as in any other cancers, there are some systemic advances which have happened, and I will briefly cover that as well. With regards to epidemiology, there is no doubt the thyroid cancer incidence is increasing worldwide and is increasing significantly. There is a 300% increase that has happened in the past 30 years. Even in India, we see an increasing trend. Even in our metropolitan tumor registry that we see an increasing trend over the past 25 years. And even our projected figures of thyroid cancer incidence, both in men and women, is shown to increase. But what is interesting is that the mortality from thyroid cancers has remained stable, and in many developed countries, it has actually declined. So that comes to the logical next question, whether this increased incidence of thyroid cancer, whether it is an epidemic of the actual magnitude of the disease, or whether it is an epidemic of overdiagnosis, as many people say. There have been a plethora of articles in literature, and the controversy rages. But what is definitely known is that there has been an increase in the incidence of papillary microcarcinomas. 40% of the incidence of carcinomas in the West or in many other countries have been microcarcinomas, and the prognosis we know is excellent. I will take your attention to one of the publications that has come about just about 2 days back. This is from this journal. It spoke about cancers, high quality data from a population-based screening registry of 26 countries, 4 continents, and what the study emphatically said, that close to 830,000 women were actually being overdiagnosed with cancers between the age groups of 15 to 84. So this sort of laid the emphasis that it is not actually an increase in the magnitude of the cancer, but it is more probably an increase in the incidence of overdiagnosis. And what actually overdiagnosis means, and this is the cartoon or the graph which I've taken from the paper itself, which was published 2 days back, and it shows the incidence of curves on various countries. And note to the extreme right or below the figure is the peak of South Korea. Know that South Korea had a national screening program for thyroid cancers, and a lot of young women have their thyroids hacked out by robotic means, and that is the reason for an as a fallout of the overdiagnosis. Now, what are the issues of overdiagnosis of these cancers? One, we know that a lot of these cancers are micropapillary carcinomas, which hardly ever kill. Then you have the harms of treatment. Although we know that most of us are really elegant thyroid surgeons, but we know that sometimes total thyroidectomy does have a little bit of morbidity associated. More importantly, from the patient's perspective, they have to be on lifelong thyroxine supplement, and we know that increasing studies are saying that thyroxine supplementation in the long run may have an increased mortality. And you must know that the psychological impact that it has on these young patients. And obviously, there are substantial health costs that are there as a fallout of these cancers. Because of this, various guidelines, and the most vehement of this was the US Preventive Screening Task Force. They have vehemently said, do not screen for thyroid cancers in the general population. Note, this recommendation is for the general population. It does not mean that thyroid cancers who are high risk, who had a prior radiation, or the familiary non-medullary thyroid cancers, which we are not going to talk about today, or the medullary thyroid cancers, they definitely fall under the bracket of screening. But generally, for differentiated thyroid cancers in the general population, a majority of the guidelines would actually say no for screening. So the trends are that we are seeing over the period, increasingly nations are actually not doing overdiagnosis. The ATA guidelines clearly say that don't evaluate sub-centimeter nodules unless they are some high-risk features. The trends are clearly reversing in South Korea right from 2012 to 2014, where the screening programs have sort of dwindled in enthusiasm. But such trends are actually not seen worldwide. And I'm sure that worldwide in the years to come, the trends of decrease or absence of screening for thyroid cancers will be seen. So the next focus will be on staging and active surveillance. Generally, for staging for any cancer, we use the TNM staging, the tumor node and metastasis staging, and for thyroid cancers, just for thyroid cancers also, you do have the TNM staging system. What we use now is the TNM8 system. But interestingly, what we also lay equal emphasis is on the risk stratification. And this is the latest risk stratification. The TNM guidelines is for accurate staging of up to 40% of the patients. We do have what is called as online calculators at this point of time. And these online calculators, a lot of them are artificial intelligence based, which incorporate both the TNM and the ATA guidelines. But however, most of these online calculators compare poorly with clinical judgment. The concordance rates is less than 80%. So the focus right now is only on clinical judgment and lack of use of online calculators in the regular practice. Now, coming to the emphasis of Y2 staging systems, the TNM staging system talks about prognosis and mortality, and we all know that in differentiated thyroid cancers, in the all cohort, the mortality rates will be around less than 2%. What is more important in the management of differentiated thyroid cancers is disease persistent and recurrence, which may be in the tune of 50%, which is not covered by the TNM staging, and it is covered more elegantly by the ATA guidelines. And hence, we have two systems for thyroid cancers, the TNM system for mortality and the ATA risk stratification system for disease persistence and disease recurrence. On top of it, we have a lot of molecular advances that have happened in the management of thyroid cancers, and it is very important to note some of the molecular advances. Some of the molecular advances are in the diagnostics of a thyroid nodule per se. Of course, this is something that has been described for a decade or so, but it is not that much used in clinical practice. I just mentioned it for completion. There are certain rule-out tests like the Afirma GEC. There are certain rule-in tests which are mRNA based. And there are a combination of both the rule-in and the rule-out tests. But as I said, none of the guidelines seem to endorse these molecular diagnostic tests, which are effectively used for the Bethesda 3 and 4 systems. But I'm sure that increasingly we will get to know more about these systems. And with the more popularity of ThyroSeq and the ThyGen or the Thyra-MR, we may get at some point of time the guidelines which are endorsing some of these for molecular diagnostics. But for now, we don't routinely use them in clinical practice. However, what is clinically relevant are these two mutations, the BRAF mutations and the TERT mutations. And as I say, these are not for diagnosis, but these are a marker for aggressive disease, and they have been endorsed by the ATA guidelines. In fact, the combination of a BRAF and a TERT mutation is very ominous. A point to be noted very interestingly is that the presence of these V600E mutation is associated with aggressive disease in tumors that are more than a centimeter. So your sub-centimeter micropapillary carcinomas are not that much affected by the presence of either BRAF or TERT mutation. I'm sure this is a work in progress, and we'll get more data as we evolve. But the BRAF and the TERT for now, as per the guidelines, are only relevant for tumors in differentiated thyroid cancers that are more than a centimeter. So we also did some thyroid cancers. We published this about a couple of years back in 2017. We found that in our cohort, about 39.6% had a somatic BRAF mutation. It did not have much of a correlation with adverse features, but it definitely predicted an adverse outcome of disease-free survival in a patient. Moreover, based on this, we had calculated a risk model based on age, BRAF mutation, there is a V600E somatic mutation, and extrathyroidal extension. And this is the risk model. Of course, we have elegantly described it in the journal. So anybody who's interested can go through it. That even in the multivariate analysis, we found that age, BRAF mutations, and extrathyroidal extension, if the presence of all three were there, the patients did poorly in terms of the survival outcomes. The BRAF that we had done at that time was measured by the PCR, the qPCR. That is something that is even now being used for detection of COVID-19. It is considered the gold standard. You know that some of these assays are a little bit costly, and that's why in real world or real-time practice, it may not be that useful, or it may not be that practical to do BRAF for all FNACs or all specimens. So we explored whether we could do the BRAF by simple immunohistochemistry mechanism, and this was the second part of the study that what we did. We found the fidelity of a novel antibody of BRAF V600E and compared it with the RT-PCR that has been the gold standard. And what we found that there was a statistically significant correlation between the BRAF mutant IHC plus the qPCR with a kappa agreement of 0.881 and a sensitivity and specificity of higher than 92%. So what we concluded was that BRAF by IHC was equivalent to PCR. It could be more cost effective, and it could be the first line method for detection of BRAF V600E mutations in thyroid cancers. We published this journal thanks to a grant by the ICON and Dr. Parekh. We published this in one of the international journals of molecular oncology, and this was also a couple of years back. Now, coming back to the TNM system, we now studied about the risk stratification system and the molecular aspects of the risk stratification system. What's changed in the TNM? And this TNM8, age. Thyroid cancers is one of the cancers in which age is prognostic. Initially, the cutoff age was 45 years, but with the latest TNM, the age has been extended to 55 years. And with personal communication from the MSKCC group, they feel that possibly in the TNM9, which may come up in 2024, you may have the age cutoff extended to about 60 years or so. So slowly we know that older the patients who get thyroid cancers, the better they do, irrespective of various other features of the disease. For example, you see here, N1A disease in older patients, they were initially stage 3 or stage 4, now they are classified as stage 2. Distant metastasis in older patients, they were initially classified as stage 4C, now they are stage 4B. And T3, of course, there have been a couple of changes in T3A and T3B. Minimal extrathyroidal extension has been removed. N1A includes the level 7, that is the superior mediastinal nodes, which is traditionally not considered. Only level 6 was considered the central compartment. Level 7 now is also in the TNM. So these are a couple of changes predominantly revolving around the age. And there is other thing that has come of some entity not being a cancer. For example, this is a non-invasive encapsulated follicular variant of papillary thyroid cancer, which is not considered a cancer any longer because of studies that show that it behaves more biologically like a follicular adenoma. So they are trying to destigmatize the word cancer So a lot of people who had initially named with cancer have been reclassified as NIFTP, and hence what is happening is the risk of malignancy in these patients have been very much low, and the criteria is essentially pathological. Now that comes to the what is exactly the role that is there of active surveillance. By meaning active surveillance, of course, this is not a new strategy. It's been there for a decade. It's not been there in thyroid cancers, though it's been more in terms of prostate cancers and many other cancers, as per se. That means you have a proven papillary carcinoma thyroid or a microcarcinoma rather, and you do wait and watch. This is a rather provocative thing. But as I said, we have a lot of publications, 9 publications, close to 4,156 patients. What they found was that tumor growth happened in only less than 5% of the patients. Nodal metastasis in only 1% of the patients. And a pooled mortality rate was just about 0.3%. And the main indication, only 15% of these patients actually went on to sort of have surgery. And the indication of surgery was not because of disease progression per se. It was because the patients didn't want to be in the active surveillance arm. So eminently, a lot of publications have shown the safety of having the policy of active surveillance in a selected cohort of cancers. Of course, this is a little controversial. For example, we don't regularly practice this in a normal clinical practice, but this is something of an advance that we must be aware of. And this was the paper by the Canadian group, which was published in the Annals of Oncology, Annals of Surgery, earlier this year in February 2020, which talks about the role of active surveillance in low-risk thyroid cancers. So much so the ATA guideline says that it's not experimental. It was considered experimental a few years back. It can be offered within a very highly selected protocolized approach called a thyroid cancer treatment choice protocol, wherein the patient also actively participates in the treatment decisions. Then what are these cancers that are actually suitable for the surveillance approach? They are what is called as a low-risk micropapillary PTCs. These are some things that we may not see much in our regular practice, but this is something that we must be aware of. Here, the teams of by Sugicani and the EPOS group, they have been extending their indications for the T1B cancers also. Favorable locations only if the location is unfavorable. For example, if the tumor is in the tracheoesophageal groove, it's posteriorly placed, if it's close proximity. If it is if it's in a close proximity to the recurrent laryngeal nerve, then you sort of don't consider this as an option. And also there are which wherein you not want to actually offer surgery as an option for these patients. You may actually offer them the option of active surveillance. The other important consideration is that you have to consent your patients very well. They have to agree for must detect a nodule size. For example, one of the indications for growth in the nodule is a 3 millimeter increase in the size of the nodule. So if you don't have an adequate proper tumor, if you don't have a patient who consents, who is regularly billing for follow-up, if you don't have a great ultrasonologist who can do a TERAD score on your nodules and actually assess your nodules, my suggestion is please don't offer the active surveillance for these patients. If you are in an institutional practice, if you have all these criteria, then you may consider offering this for a selected group of patients. So the third aspect is about thyroid incidentalomas. Incidentalomas have been classically described in thyroid and adrenal gland. 2 types of incidentalomas. One was the ultrasound detected incidentalomas. The other, more recently, we are seeing with the increasing use of PET-CT, we are seeing more of PET-CT detected incidentalomas. There are 2 things that one must keep in mind when we discuss about incidentalomas. One is the incidence of malignancies, and the other thing is incidence of the detection of the incidentalomas in the general population. With regards to the ultrasound, you have more incidence in the general population. There is about up to 10 to 40% of the patients would have incidentalomas in the general population, but the incidence of malignancies will be low in the range of 3 to 5%. However, in PET-CT, the incidence is around 3 to 5% in general population, but a third of them, close to 30% of them, would be positive for malignancies. And this is the data which is coming up from the meta-analysis. And there are also autopsy series that say that the patients who died because of some other cause incidentally had some amount of incidentalomas in 20 to 67% of the patients. So that's the That's the indolent nature of these cancers. You detect a lot of these in autopsy series and ultrasound series. A vast majority of them are not malignant. But kindly note that the PET-CT in detected incidental is a little ominous. We did some of our study in our own institute, our experience of over 1,000 patients who underwent a PET-CT over the year. What we did found is 11% had thyroid incidentalomas and 10% of these patients harbored a malignancy. Of note that only 14% of our patients who actually had incidentalomas were further evaluated. We went on to publish this data earlier this year in Jan 2020 in the World Journal of Nuclear Medicine. And I think our approach is, this is our data, which is almost very few data from India. Like in BRAF mutations also, we do have very less data from India. AIMS has got some data, Tata's have got some data. Even in thyroid incidentalomas, we are only the second center to actually have published some large data on thyroid incidentalomas. And this is the more recent data which has come up in the World Journal earlier this year. The third and the more interesting part would be the extent of surgery. And that has actually changed from 2009, which were the 1 centimeter rule. Anything more than a centimeter would entail a total thyroidectomy. Now we know that some of these lesions between 1 to 4 centimeters, especially if they're low risk and intrathyroidal, can be offered a hemithyroidectomy. And this is based on large retrospective data across many studies. So these patients do not need a total thyroidectomy. Levothyroxine replacement can be avoided in a majority of these patients. And what has also happened is there has been an evolution in the surgical approach also. Conventional thyroid surgery was there for the majority of the years, and even now it's there. It's even still considered one of the gold standards. But what has evolved during the years is video-assisted surgeries, endoscopic surgeries, and robotic thyroidectomies. And there is a plethora of data on this, and it's so very confusing to know which is better, which is not. I would just take you to the most recent publication that had come up in one of the journals from the Chinese group. This was earlier this year. I bring up this because it compared 3 different aspects: the total endoscopic thyroidectomy, the endoscopic assisted thyroidectomy, and the conventional open thyroidectomy approach. And the conclusion based on the authors seemed to be very, very balanced for me. What they said is all 3 types of thyroidectomies are safe and reliable. So if you are an open thyroid surgeon, I don't think that you should be fuming or fretting or feeling let low. I think there is data, even contemporary data as 2020 data also says that it is safe and good for all benign lesions, and definitely safe for malignant lesions. There is a note of caution for the use of endoscopic approaches in malignant thyroid lesions, especially the ones that are more than 3 centimeters. Of course, in skilled hands, like for example in Professor Macaulay series, you do have certain lesions that are taken which are more than 3 centimeters, but I don't think that should be standard of care. If it's a malignant thyroid cancer more than 3 centimeters, I would advise an open approach. For a benign, of course, the options are always there of doing an endoscopic approach or a robotic approach if you have the facilities in your center to do that. Otherwise, a good conventional open thyroidectomy still stands good enough. And I know there are a lot of series which vehemently say that the open approach is much better. What we know today is there is a comparison. Both these approaches are safe in skilled hands. Coming to the more complicated topic of risk stratification, I'll try to simplify it in a couple of slides for you all. Risk stratification consists of 2 components. One is the initial risk stratification that changed from ATA 2009 to ATA 2015, and it's a continuum of change. What the change has happened in 3 aspects. One is the incorporation of BRAF, and I told you that the BRAF, we showed you our data. So BRAF is actually coming up in guideline as well. So even though a majority of the centers, and even we do not do BRAF as a routine in terms of the regular practice, but it is coming up in certain risk stratification guidelines. And I'm sure that in the coming years, we may, or our pathologists or molecular pathologists will be forced to do BRAF mutations for some of these patients. We know that intrathyroidal BRAF is a low risk. A BRAF which is there intrathyroidal in a centimeter would be a high risk. And a BRAF which is there with extrathyroidal extension would be in a very high risk. There is also a categorization between the number of nodes and the size of the nodes. there was a lot of controversy whether the nodes actually predicted prognosis. That we know that initial risk stratification nodes are important. Any node with an extracapsular extension or any node more than 3 centimeters, like in the squamous cell carcinomas, they offer high risk in a thyroid carcinoma as well. When it comes to the lower risk, we do have some of the nodes, less than 5 nodes, and it is also important that your pathologist looks into the amount of metastasis that's there in the node. So they say less than 2 mm, they fall into a low risk. So there's a lot of job for a pathologist in terms of risk stratification for thyroid. They not only have to look into the number of nodes, they also have to look into whether there is a microscopic spread or a macroscopic spread. Also, whether there is extracapsular spread. That's of course very common in squamous cell carcinomas, but in thyroid also it is becoming very common. And they may have to look and report for BRAF and TERT mutations, because a combination of BRAF and TERT mutations, as I said, falls under a very high risk. Now, what's the need for a dynamic? We know that the initial risk stratification is there, and why is the need for a dynamism? The dynamism comes because there are two things. The risk changes with time, and the risk can actually elevate the patient's anxiety, and I'll come to it in the next couple of slides to simplify it. Most of the patients of, say, intermediate and high risk would require radioiodine ablation after a thyroid surgery, and the response to radioiodine would actually determine the risk. There could be 4 types of responses: excellent response, structural incomplete response, and 2 other intermediate grade of responses, which I'll come to. And what do we mean by excellent responders? Initially, when I was training, we used to do a large number of radioactive iodine scans in the follow-up of thyroid cancer patients. Now, no longer. I think the present guidelines say that you do a good stimulated serum thyroglobulin, always measure your anti-thyroglobulin antibody also along, and do a normal imaging like an neck ultrasound. So if any of these 3 things, stimulated thyroglobulin, anti-thyroglobulin antibody, or your neck ultrasound is abnormal, then it could mean a different connotation. If all these 3, your stimulated TG is less than 1, no detectable anti-thyroglobulin antibodies, neck ultrasound is clean post your thyroidectomy, and your radioiodine scan, that means your patient has done excellently well. If your neck ultrasound shows disease, that means it's a structural incomplete responses, and anything in between these 2 means indeterminate responses or incomplete biochemical responses, as I have shown. So you have a spectrum based on the responses. Either it is excellent on one end or incomplete structural on the other end. And in between, you have 2 components of indeterminate responses and incomplete biochemical responses. In fact, the Sloan Kettering group of especially Michael Turtle has done a lot of work on this. And what is the implication of this? You know that supposing a patient was a high-risk patient to start off with, but your patient has done excellently well after radioiodine treatment, the risk actually decreases to about 14%. However, and again, if your patient was intermediate risk to start off with, and he's been an excellent responder, the risk of recurrence that was initially around 40% decreases from 1 to 2%. So you know that based on the response, your high risk may no longer become totally high risk for all the time. And more often than not, it is the intermediate risk patients that actually sort of slip into lower risk. So a lot of the intermediate risk patients, by a favorable response, their risk profile actually gets adjusted to become an excellent responder, or the risk is actually as that of a low risk. And this is what is the concept of dynamic risk stratification, and we know that it is variable over time. And it is also important from the management perspective, as I said, how you follow up these patients in terms of thyroglobulin measurement, in terms of duration, and also your TSH goals. I know we are very, very particular now of not totally suppressing. Initially, there was a tendency to put these patients, make these patients hyperthyroid to its extent, so that you could sort of suppress your TSH much lower. But we know that too much suppression is also not good. So in lower excellent responders, we keep the TSH in up to range of 0.5 to 2. And based on the incremental responses, if it is an intermediate, indeterminate response or incomplete response or a higher response, your TSH would remain more suppressed. So the final part of my talk, and I think towards the end, I think the systemic advances, and since it's largely a surgical group, I would not go into a lot, but there are a plethora of studies, nearly 100 studies, I must say, of molecules that have been looked after in the systemic advances. It is very essential for us as thyroid clinicians and thyroid surgeons to know a little bit of systemic responses, because previously a medical oncologist had no place in the thing of thyroid cancers. It was only an endocrinologist, a clinician, a thyroid surgeon, and a nuclear medicine physician. The radiation oncologist has very little role, and medical oncologists have practically no role. But that seems to have reversed to an extent because of these studies. And the more important thing that is happening is now the radioactive iodine therapy. And I think this is a big topic in itself. I may not be able to cover anything beyond this slide. As I said, that based on the categorization of initial risk stratification, a lot of the high risk and the intermediate risk patients would actually get radioiodine. But we are very selective now in not giving radioiodine to the low risk, and definitely not to the very low risk patients. And this is something that this is a philosophy that we must understand in the management. Because too much of radioactive iodine or radioactive iodine in the absence of any activity is nothing. That is, you're doing nothing good for the patient. So as I said, the other thing is about the radioactive refractory cancer. So as long as the tumors are radioactive responsive, we know that we have a modality for treating them. But once the cancer becomes dedifferentiated, or it no longer concentrates radioactive, it's called a radioactive refractory cancer. And radioactive refractory cancer has actually got 5 definitions, at least 5, and you can go through that. I don't really want to do that in the interest of time. What we know is that once the cancer becomes radioactive refractory, the overall survival dips 10% in comparison to about 50% or more in a radioactive iodine avid disease. We had 2 tyrosine kinase inhibitors, sorafenib and lenvatinib, approved in the management of patients with radioactive refractory progressive differentiated thyroid cancers. And this is something that we already have some experience, and we are collating our data to sort of get it published. But there are 2-3 caveats that we must know, that these therapies are pretty toxic as well. There are therapy associated morbidities and some serious life-threatening mortalities also with these therapies. So these therapies are not sort of for every other patient. And these therapies are also important to give for certain patients. In fact, I would urge you to read Michael Turtle's paper on when to start these therapies based on your tumor doubling time and based on other therapies, especially on if the disease is progressive. If the patient is indolent and asymptomatic, you just follow up with serial imagings, do nothing, and you just follow up these patients. The timing of these therapies is a work in progress, and it is something that is very important for us to know. And as I said, there are several ongoing studies of tyrosine kinase inhibitors, BRAF inhibitors. I said that BRAF is overexpressed in up to 40% of the patients. BRAF inhibitor like vemurafenib is there in the management of melanomas. There has been a lot of inhibitors that have been studied in differentiated thyroid cancers as well. Promising role there, but none of them have actually come into clinical practice. Vemurafenib, and there is one more other molecule. Immunotherapy has made great inroads in many cancers, breast, lung, etc. In thyroid cancers, they are trying to use immunotherapies along with a combination of BRAF inhibitors and tyrosine kinase inhibitors. I would like to draw your attention to one of the review articles that I had actually written, and this was written maybe about 3 years, I think it was 3 years ago. It encapsulates whatever I've said today. Of course, a lot what I've said today is more contemporary. This review article which I had written was an editorial, rather it was more than a review, gives you a gist of whatever headings that we have talked to you today. It's been relevant, but of course the evidences, whatever I've shared you today, are much, much more contemporary. And I would actually thank, I would end my talk here, thank Dr. Patel for this opportunity again. And I must say that whatever I've talked to you, especially for the trainees, is about recent advances. Some of them have to be used with discretion. When you are going for your examinations, be a little cautious when you are speaking to your examiners about this. Don't speak out of turn if you don't really know the evidences. Whatever I've told you, I can assure you, I can vouch you. These are some of our hard data. So these are the data which we have published. We vouch for the data that I have presented today. But whenever you're doing presenting in examinations, be a little conscious about what you are, especially for a present case, especially when you're talking about active surveillance. That always happens whenever a topic is on recent advances. But since it was a mandate for me to take on recent advances, I had to sort of give you this overview for you to go up and read through our publications and also the other publications that have been there in the literature. And I hope that this talk was not just like any other thyroid cancer talk and give you a little more perspectives. And I think I'll end my talk here, and I'll be very happy to take any questions, comments, and I would like to thank Dr. Bhatt again for the opportunity. Thank you.
Brilliant lecture, Arvind, as usual.
Yeah,
and,
thank you, sir.
The floor is open for questions. Please, anybody who wants to have a word with him, please come up and speak.